Hi, good morning, good afternoon from wherever you're listening to us. We're just trying to transition to the next panel. So kindly bear with us and stay shortly for the next session to begin. All right. So good morning, good afternoon once again, and thank you so much, our young panelists. I think I can refer to you as such. Those who really hold the future, listening to the conversation from yesterday and also this morning and afternoon's panel. I want us to now come to you to look at what we also have to do beyond business and finance. What are the role for active citizenship, in this conversation around climate change and energy transition? So to help us really anchor this panel will be Mr. Julius Mbatia, Youth Director Youth for Sustainable Development Goals, Kenya. And Julius is a climate justice advocate and governance expert with 3 years of experience working with the non-for-profit sector, where he advocates for climate actions at local, national, regional, and global levels. He is an expert in climate finance, working particularly on the Green Climate Fund. He is currently an alternate active observer to the GCF, representing developing countries. As a young climate leader in Kenya and Africa, Julius has volunteered for more than 5 years in various youth movements. As a young climate leader, he has been driving public climate discourse and been involved in global climate policy processes, representing Kenyan youth in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change as a young negotiator. So thank you very much, Julius, and I will hand over to you at this point to anchor the panel for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's good to actually be introduced in such a way. And we are happy to definitely be here, all of us. And just quick updates first before we go into the introduction of the panel and also just go into the depth of the session. Some quick housekeeping rules to all our participants. Please do select your preferred language by clicking the globe icon at the bottom right of the screen. And then also, if you have any questions, just drop them in the chat box. And there will be also a virtual photo shoot of speakers and participants at the end of this panel. So we will do that. And then also we would want to kindly have you register at acep.africa so that we can have the details of anyone getting to join. I would want to now at this time just state first that African youth play a critical role in climate action. And this is an important topic of our time because it determines how the future, we proceed into the future, but also how we deal with the present. And with us today, we have an interesting team of panelists who I would want to allow introduce themselves because this is a people's or citizen engagement panel. And first, I would want to ask Dr. Festus Asaga to introduce himself. And as he does that, let him tell us within 30 seconds why citizen engagement in climate action matters. Dr. Festus, please have the floor.
Thank you very much, Julius. And thanks also, ACEP, for the invitation to speak on this August panel. Why citizen engagement matters? Simply because the youth are the future. And if you look at the demography across the world, Africa tends to have a youthful population. And in fact, projections also tend to suggest that Africa is highly vulnerable to anthropogenic climate change. And so it really matters to engage all on board in order to find lasting solutions to the problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Festus. I would want to go to Ezekiel, please. Tell us what you do. We missed that from you, Dr. Festus, but we'll come back to that in your presentation shortly. Please, Ezekiel, tell us what you do and why citizen engagement matters.
Yeah, thank you, Julius, for this opportunity, and a very good morning to and good afternoon to all, everyone. So I'm Chief Ezekiel. I coordinate the Strategic Youth Network for Development, which is basically a youth-oriented NGO that promotes youth inclusion in the governance of our natural resources and environmental sector. We also convene the Youth in Natural Resources and Environmental Governance platform as a way to learn and share among young people on different environmental actions, and also to embark on joint advocacy in a concerted manner. So just to add on to what Asaga said, I think the role citizen engagement is very important. They must also appreciate and understand why they must benefit from the natural resources, and more importantly, their views and opinions also matter, in the whole governance of our natural resources. So basically, I think that's one cardinal reason why citizen engagement is critical. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ezekiel. Laura, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Laura Stewart. I'm a PhD or a DPhil student at the University of Oxford. I was born and raised in the Kingdom of Swaziland, or Eswatini. Why does the topic of today's conversation matter? I think and perhaps I'll get into it more as the conversation evolves, but what it comes down to is that there are so many I think injustices that the oil and gas industry has perpetuated and propagated in Africa. And so, because of climate change and the transition that we're making to renewables, I think that there's an unprecedented opportunity to reframe how African natural resources are used, and also to reframe how the value chain engages or allows opportunities for African youth to participate. So I think, ultimately that youth or citizens who want to be engaged in the transition to renewables should be primarily concerned with the implications that it has across sectors. So not just for employment, but also for, politics and for governance, which is sort of a working theme of today's or today and yesterday's summit. So youth should be interested in making sure that the transition is just, that it's equitable, and that civil society especially, and I think the governance aspect of the economy is included.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you also for being with us. I would like to ask Ekemini, please, to introduce yourself.
All right, thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Ekemini John. I am currently an MSc student in energy systems at the University of Oxford, and I also work as an energy consultant for the Oxford Energy Society. I feel like this discussion is important because if you look at climate change and the effect it has, it's not just on the companies, it's not just on the government, it's on every one of us. So more like if we were to bring a change, we need everybody on the table, the citizens, every single person. So that's why this discussion is really important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much to our panelists for the introductions. And as we ask Dr. Festus to please provide us with a lead presentation, some of the key things that are coming out is that young people have the power. We need a transition that is just, equitable, and we also need to reframe the narrative that has been shaped, particularly in regards to our continent. Dr. Festus, would you please make the presentation, and we will take it up from there.
Thanks very much, Julius. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
I'm just going to share my screen, and so please give me a thumbs up if you can see my shared screen. Apologies for that.
We still don't have your screen yet.
I believe you should have my shared, you should be able to see my shared screen now.
Perfect, it's come up. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Julius, and thanks to the ACEP team for putting this together, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My presentation this morning will focus on promoting citizenry participation in climate action, focusing on the African context. Citizenry participation can play an important part in efforts to achieve climate neutrality. However, in order to achieve the desired effects, engagement needs to be carried out in a way that is meaningful, both for the citizens and the institutions involved. In particular, this presentation highlights the broader context of why this matters and some suggested avenues for citizenry engagement on the unfolding discourse, climate discourse for responsible climate action and innovation in Africa. And so, as a general background, although climate change is a global problem, vulnerability is locally experienced. Africa is projected to be disproportionately affected by the wide-ranging impacts of anthropogenic climate change. This is despite the negligible contribution to cumulative greenhouse gas emissions over time. And estimates suggest that about 4% of total global CO2 emissions are attributable to Africa. And Africa is at a critical transition phase as its development is intimately connected to the sustainable exploitation of natural resources, particularly oil and gas. And as you would see from this slide, Africa is particularly vulnerable due to its geography, weak governance, and considerably limited adaptive capacity and widespread poverty. And so climate change is a particular threat to the continued economic growth and to livelihoods of vulnerable populations. And from the bottom half of the map, this is based on a recent analysis of 181 countries' vulnerability to climate change from the University of Notre Dame. And countries in sub-Saharan Africa fill the bottom 10 spaces for survivability, with Somalia being named as the least likely to survive climate change. And in Africa's Agenda 2063, which was concluded in 2013, it recognizes climate change as a major challenge for the continent's development. And so, responding to the interconnected challenges of poverty, inequality, natural resource degradation, and climate change requires mechanisms that enable people to actively engage and freely as agents in policy and decision making. And as you can see from this slide, climate change is essentially a multi-dimensional problem that spans the breadth of society, economy, health, to mention but a few. And for example, it is estimated that global warming of 2 degrees would put over 50% of the continent's population at risk of undernourishment. And the same projections also tend to suggest that climate change will lead to an equivalent of 2 to 4% annual loss in GDP in the region by 2040. And so, assuming that international efforts keep global warming below 2 degrees, the continent could still face climate change adaptation costs something in the region of $50 billion per year by 2050. And so this further underscores the need for fair-reaching and meaningful participation in climate action. And so, despite the renewed attention in recent years, the clarion call for active citizenry participation in climate action is not new, and that should be at the forefront of our discussion. From Rio 1992 declaration to the 2015 Paris Agreement, giving citizens the voice in climate change-related decision-making has long been recognized and championed by intergovernmental organizations and bodies. And within this context, there is widespread consensus across the academic and policy circles that effective and meaningful participation is crucial to ensuring that policies are designed in a socially just manner that sufficiently acknowledges and respects the rights of communities, and more importantly, also build resilience. But then nevertheless, what remains a key challenge, particularly in the African context, is the pathways to initiating and, more importantly, sustaining active citizenry participation in climate action. And as succinctly captured by the Nobel Peace laureate, Professor Wangari Maathai, it is extremely important to foster widespread understanding or appreciation of the issues of climate change, which has often been described as abstract and overly technical or a scientific subject. And access to climate information in locally relatable and easy to understand languages is critical aspect of fostering active participation. And so there has been pockets of interventions and efforts at citizenry engagement to increase participation. However, beyond the pockets of initiatives and calls for action, planned engagement remains necessary to ensure that concerted efforts of sustainable transitioning of African economies is achieved. And this invariably requires that we rethink how citizenry are meaningfully engaged in the climate discourse and decision making. Within this context, great strides have been taken in terms of widening the engagement with and participation in planning around climate change. For example, civil society and private sector groups now contribute to national and global climate discussions that were once dominated by scientists and experts. However, a notable gap relates to formal participation by unorganized publics or groups around climate action, which remains limited despite the increased calls about widespread communication of climate change. And I believe that is precisely why this discussion is important, in a way how to really galvanize that grassroots support to rally behind concerted actions to really tackle this threat of climate change. So how do we ensure that meaningful participation in climate action is fostered and sustained? In achieving this end, it is important to recognize that participatory spaces are not neutral. They are created for multiple purposes, providing opportunities for agency and inclusion, but also exclusion and hierarchy. Recognizing these limits to participation remains crucial in ensuring that the process are inclusive and there is an overall local ownership so as to galvanize widespread support for the intended changes. And as you can see from this slide, it is important to also be able to ensure that the communication around the science is happening in a way that is easily digestible across different groups. And I think that in itself constitutes the key missing link, whereby we are not really seeing communication enough happening in the popular or the mainstream media, even around conversations on climate action, even in the particular context of Africa. And this is something that needs to be ramped up. And more importantly, given that the youth represent the future also, and given that they are also tech savvy, there is a need to also leverage on digitization in order to create platforms or avenues to rally behind in order to drive home the action even around climate action. But then again, it is important in pursuing all these initiatives to bear in mind that done poorly, participation can result in undemocratic outcomes by reinforcing existing power inequalities and marginalizing minority perspectives, and also creating dysfunction consensus or fostering cynicism in natural fact. In this regard, whose knowledge input counts? What is the level of engagement, the extent of indigenization of solutions, the timing? Does it happen before, during, and after the problem framing? And the message really impacts on the overall outcome of the participatory process. And I believe these are things that we keep in mind, and then even as the discussion ensues, we will then be able to interrogate further. And so in a nutshell, and as a way forward, although there is widespread acknowledgement of the importance of meaningful citizenry participation, that end in itself, it is important to recognize that it is important to recognize that there is still lack of clarity or consensus on the extent and the nature of engagement with the unorganized groups. And so, who are yet the crucial but yet often neglected actors in all of these conversations. Importantly, for us to galvanize this support, it is important for us to know that participation is not a linear process. It is complex and it is multi-layered. And in that respect, it is important for us to think of participation in terms of rights of citizenship, rather than stakeholders who are involved to represent their interests. And the last point would have to do with the fact that to design and promote contextualized approaches to citizenry engagement in climate action, we need to pursue it in a manner that is sensitive to the underlying socio-political, cultural, and economic context that necessarily determines and shapes outcomes. And at this point, I will just stop here, and I believe that even as we go further in the discussion, we can then be able to unpack the practical pathways to moving forward on this agenda. Thanks very much for your attention. Back to you, Julius.
Thank you so much, Dr. Festus. That was really insightful. And just getting us into the discussion bit of it, you've set it out clear that one, the problem is with us, and number two, because the problem is with us, then we need to see how we can, all of us, through participatory means, engage in addressing the problem. And then also you've brought out the issue to do with communication. So how do we then get the people who are on the front line of climate change impacts, vulnerable communities within our society, the youth, speak to climate change more clearly, but also being involved in a meaningful way to drive policy interventions that can actually cause a transformation within the continent. And that was a really interesting presentation, and thank you again for that. And for us to be able to unpack it further, we would want to open the floor and go to actually our panelists who will be able to respond to a couple of questions. And first, I would want to start with Chibeze. As you know, we are also at a point where we blame the developed countries, the North, for actually driving greenhouse gas emissions. So do you think from your perspective that citizenry expectations on the promise of oil and gas, the ones that also the North has been pushing a lot, do you think that that promise within the continent of Africa is being met? Chibeze.
Yeah, thank you, Julius. And then also want to thank Dr. Asaga for starting the piece. Yeah, so in terms of citizens' expectation, when it comes to Africa, I would say it could be a bit complex. And so I want to take it from the context of countries in terms of how countries have managed the expectations of their citizens. Because first and foremost, some countries are doing well when it comes to how they are managing their oil and gas. Some are also not doing very well. So depending on where the person lives or who you are talking to, then it can give you a fair understanding whether citizens' expectations of oil and gas, are being met. So of course, we have a fair idea as to what is happening in Nigeria, in Angola, and currently even in Ghana. So depending on where people live, they can tell you what their expectations are. But in this context, I would want to focus when it comes to Ghana, just to share our experience here. So in terms of our expectations, I would say that one of the good things that happened in Ghana is that even before we started exploring oil and gas in commercial quantities, there was a conscious effort to engage citizens, to put in place the right, enabling environment, the right policies, the right framework to ensure that we all benefit from the oil and gas exploration. In fact, we discovered oil around 2007, but so we had to stagger the process to put in place all the mechanisms. So it took us about 3 years before we started exploring, oil and gas in commercial quantities by 2010. So that's about a 3-year period. So the question is, have we really benefited as citizens when it comes to oil and gas in Ghana? From where I sit, I would say that not to my expectation, in spite of all the laws, in spite of all the policies put in place, we are not really benefiting as citizens. And one of the ways that I've shown that the reason why I'm saying that is because of some work done by one of the, if I can call them,
Sorry, Ezekiel, we are losing you a bit.
A kind of a regulatory. Can you hear me?
Yes, we lost you for a larger part of the intervention, but just keep on going. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So, so I was talking about in the context of Ghana, whether our citizens are really benefiting from the oil and gas processes. So, in terms of putting in place policies, strategies, we've done very well. But when it comes to the implementation, that is where the gap or the challenge is. As I speak, we are still not unsure how we are even managing the revenues from our oil and gas exploration. Because as I speak, one of the key CSOs in Ghana, still started platform on oil and gas, and even the PIAC, is still asking government that there is some money, oil revenue money, that has still not been accounted for. And that money is supposed to enhance the welfare of citizens. So if government is not able to account for those kind of resources or money, then it tells us that citizens are not getting the benefit from the oil and gas exploration. So that is one aspect. So in terms of whether citizens are being benefiting, it's a mixed bag. Yes, in terms of policies, in terms of laws, but when it comes to the actual, the physical benefits or the direct benefits, I would say there's a lot of gap and there's a lot of work to be done as far as Ghana is concerned. So that would be my initial submission on that for now. Thank you, Julius.
Thanks, Ezekiel. Dr. Festus, do you think we are having a win-win for the citizens within the issues to do with exploration of oil and gas and oil governance in this continent? What's your perspective?
Yeah, thanks so much, Julius. And I largely agree with Chibize's point, even on the issues at hand. And from where I sit, I would say it is important to also acknowledge the fact that aside from the promise that in actual fact, the exploration of oil and gas in itself is going to turn the tide even for our economies, it is also important to also recognize the important challenge that we are confronted with in terms of the fact that these are key economies which are grappling with several challenges. And for the very reason that even most of these economies are also largely even agrarian, aside from even the fact that exploration of oil in itself promises to also bring to the fore other central revenues that is pivotal to turning things around. And so within that context in itself, it was not only going to be, if you like, the answer to the kind of challenges that we are confronted with. But then I believe that, again, as Chibeze rightly highlighted, given the right kind of policy frameworks and engagement mechanisms, there was always the expectation that revenues from the oil and gas sector could also be able to support where there are revenue gaps, more importantly, to support other sustainable community-based interventions. But as to whether there has been a win-win in that respect, I'm not so sure that has really happened, to the extent that, again, we still witness the fact that there are still some kind of weak governance arrangements also, even in some contexts, which is important to also focus on. Even aside from the fact that there has now even been an open engagement, particularly championed by civil society groups, which is a laudable effort, I still believe that a lot can be done. And in fact, even at this particular time with this kind of sustained momentum around climate action, that can also be a channel by which we can also throw the spotlight further on such engagements to ensure that the benefits do indeed even inure to these communities and not just happening in a piecemeal fashion. That is what I would say for now.
Thank you. And just to you, Laura, you have been able to witness some of the things that are happening within the continent. For example, in Uganda, where we've had a lot of issues to do with oil and gas, particularly the oil itself, whereby the government has had to put in place measures that have at times seen disenfranchised communities being expropriated of their land. What is your perspective? Are we actually winning and making progress in oil and gas governance within this continent?
Thanks for the question, Julius. I appreciate it. I guess I should frame my remarks in general. I was hoping I was expecting that there'd be some sort of opening remark. So perhaps let me frame this response as an opening remark. You know, I think the fossil fuel industry is generally or globally organized by transnational corporations, but state-owned corporations are also important. And they're important because these industries, like you've rightly mentioned, tend to be at the center of controversy. They're at the center of controversy for two reasons. Firstly, because of their harmful environmental impacts or the harmful environmental impacts of their activities. And secondly, because states that generate substantial revenues from resource rents tend to display a common set of pathologies. So that's, you know, rentierism, corruption, violence. And so as a political scientist and as a human geographer, I'm especially interested in that second issue. That's the internal pathologies that resources tend to create in a state. And I guess more importantly, how resource states are produced through longer regimes of coloniality and uneven development. So, you know, the role, I guess, of resources, whether it's oil and gas or other natural resources, in shaping meaning or in shaping politics and governance in particular countries. There's a professor at the University of Durham, Professor Ray Hudson. He's a geographer, and he writes about how natural resources are not naturally resources. So the fact is that these resources, whether we're talking about renewables or oil and gas, are useful in some way because of social, political, and cultural work that goes into making a part of nature a resource. And so it's that process that confers meaning and confers value. And that's the process that can be problematic, because if this Professor Hudson is right, then these aren't naturally resources, and it's politics that makes them as such. And so one of the forms, or one of the ways that politics makes them resources, is this process of sort of becoming. Unfortunately, in Africa, that process of becoming tends to be through struggle, through violence, and through corruption. So many of the countries that we see that depend on oil and gas are also the most politically and economically troubled. We can consider places like Uganda, we can consider places like Nigeria, and in fact, we can consider places like South Africa as well. So I guess the moral of the story for me is that most oil and gas rich communities are actually very poor. You can think of the Niger Delta. And they're also usually underdeveloped, they're polluted, and they're unsafe. And, you know, I think a previous summit discussed this idea of the paradox of the plenty or the resource curse. So I won't bemoan the point too much, but I think the fact is we have plenty of examples of contestations over oil and gas, including between communities, between companies, and between countries. And so the point is that it's easy to think that politics or governance is something that is done to resources, but we should really be worried about the ways in which resources, whether they're natural oil and gas or renewables, tend to shape the political. So that governance question, I think, for me, begins from that sort of vantage point.
Thank you so much. And we had to go into that background so that we can be able to root this conversation from where we are coming from and where we are right now. And where we are right now is a state where climate change is happening. And we've seen the climate impacts. And at the same time, we have global commitments of reducing emissions, but which still have some way to go in terms of actually enhancing that emission reduction. And within a reality where the African people are suffering, the African youth are suffering due to climate change impact. Coming to you, Ekimine, what are some of the gaps that we can identify when talking about climate change to a common African citizen? Do they know about climate change? And why don't they know, and why are they not fully engaged?
Thank you so much, Julius, for the question. I'd like to talk about climate change communication in the context of the key actors involved in this. Basically, we know that when it comes to energy resources, renewables, non-renewables, that there are key actors involved. We have the international government, we have the national government, the sub-national government, the energy companies, non-energy companies, and then the citizens. So in as much as we may not be able to like specifically state that, oh yeah, this particular group, this particular actor contributes more, we can actually say that every single one of us, from the national government to the citizens, feel the impact of climate change. But once it comes to climate change communication, there's been a lot of gaps. Like basically, for me, I see climate change communication as letting people know what is coming, what is happening. You warn them, you persuade them, you mobilize them, and let them know that together we can work out a plan for our environment, the place we live. Coming from the Niger Delta region of Nigeria, a major oil producing state in Nigeria, I see a lot of things going on, and a lot of people do not know about these things. A lot of people do not know about climate change. A lot of people do not even agree that climate change is happening. So there's been this gap of how do we get people to not see climate change, as something scientific, something that scientists just came together to discuss, and oh yeah, they dumped it on us that our climate change is happening. A lot of Africans, a lot of people have not heard about climate change, and it is really important to have like a discourse. And then what I see as a gap in communication for climate change is that when governments eventually talk about climate change, they talk about it as something that is going to happen in the future, whereas it's happening. It's something that's already happening. So if I discuss a problem with you, I'm saying, oh yeah, there's going to be a problem coming in the future, and the natural human instinct is, oh yeah, let's wait for the problem. When it comes, we now start tackling it. But if this climate change discourse is given in the context of, yes, this thing is happening at the moment, yes, we can feel the effect. Because where I come from, Niger Delta, you basically just wake up someday and there are suits all over your roof. You wake up and you see suits, like in Port Harcourt, you see suits on the nostrils of the people dwelling very close to the oil exploration facilities. So these things are happening, these effects are happening. So we need to, like, instead of communicate climate change as something that's coming, the gap I see with this government is the government needs to improve and let the people know that climate change is not something of the future. It's something that is currently happening. Thank you.
That's an interesting perspective. And coming to Chibeze again, the question of what exactly are the priorities of communities when it comes to climate change in Africa? What would communities want addressed urgently by governments? Could you please try and help us unpack that? Because then we need to understand what then they need to bring out as they communicate to government. So Chibeze, what are the priorities of communities? What do we need to urgently address as a continent in view of climate change?
Thank you, Julius, once again for this opportunity. So in terms of what communities need or citizens need, when it comes to Africa, there's one thing that cuts across, because I read somewhere that about 60%, if not more, of Africans are involved in agriculture, as their main source of livelihood. So if that is the case, then it means that, people, the farmers, how are they being affected by climate impact? And therefore that talks about how can they cope, the right coping mechanisms, the resilience that they need to combat the impact of climate change. So in Africa, that is one key area that citizens will be looking at. But if I want to speak specifically from the context of Ghana, Ghana basically is divided into 3 zones. We have the northern zone, the middle zone, and the southern zone. So the southern zone basically is about the coastal areas. The middle zone is about the forest areas. And then the northern zone is about the high temperature areas. So it means that people are being affected differently based on their geographical location. So those in the northern part are facing, expensive heat waves. So the weather is becoming very hot for them to cope. So again, they will need some mechanism that will help them to cope, with that high temperature zones. And then those in the forest areas, most of them who are farmers, depend on the rainfall for their sowing their crops. But because now rainfall has become erratic, they have become unpredictable. So farmers are unable, even to sow or to look at the weather to inform their way of life. So that is even affecting their business. And even that, not only they depend on the rainforest, but we've seen a situation. I think about a month or two ago, I watched on television how the one heavy rainfall, virtually washed, all the investment of a farming group, in one community. So they've lost their investment. I even saw cattle actually swimming in water, being washed away. So you can see people's capital actually being washed by the flood, all because of climate impact. So for them, how can they survive? They are losing their money. What is the guarantee that when they go to the bank for loan, they are rest assured that they can still be in business and not suffer again from climate impact? So again, their needs are peculiar. And then those in the coastal areas who I can call them fishermen or fishers, depending on the sea for the source of livelihood. One research also shows that because of the warming nature of the sea, now the fishes are moving deep, either deep into the sea or far away. So they're not coming to the shore closer. So what it means is that fishermen will have to now move deep into the sea in order to catch their fish. So people are being affected differently because of the climate impact. So what it means is that based on the unique impact that climate change is having on community people, then they expect that local put in place some mechanism to address their situation. So from the top of my head, when it comes to agri, we can look at the irrigation facility so that even if there's no rain, they can have water for their farms. And then even those in the north, if instead of wasting, quote unquote, wasting the sun, the heat of the sun, can we harness that sunshine and convert into some solar energy and power, to help people at home and all that. So for me, depending on where people live, then we can tailor-made, provide some solutions, for them to cope or tackle the impact of climate change in those respective communities. Yeah, so that would be my take on this.
A question actually just came in from the floor, and this is also tied to what you just talked about, Ezekiel, but I would want Dr. Festus to actually respond to this. You said, Dr. Festus, that climate change is a complex topic, and also how difficult it is to engage communities on climate change. Would you give some insights around how to make this thing practical? I'm calling it thing now because we need to hit it on the head. How do we make it practical and such that even governments can actually engage communities, and what mechanisms would you suggest?
Thank you very much, Julius, and a really good question. And I would like to take it off from where I believe Laura and Chibueze and Ikemini left it off. I believe that some important points have really come to the fore. And on the communication side, two important things is noteworthy. One has to do with the framing of the problem, and number two has to do with the language by which the problem itself is articulated. And Ikemini made a very important point that if framed as something that is a future problem, then the natural inclination is that people would not necessarily be predisposed to engage immediately with this concern. And this is also a point that has been well articulated by Chibueze in his point, in the fact that we already seen manifestations of this happening in terms of flooding events in different places. We also seen the livelihoods and investment of people being precarious and insecure, and even poverty further exacerbated by the impact of anthropogenic climate change. So I believe that these kind of experiences have not still come to the fore enough, even though we are talking about it in terms of pathways to adaptation. I think that as a starting point for the conversation, it is important to anchor this in the local realities. Because then again, if people see the problem reflecting adequately what they see immediately happening in their environments, then the natural inclination is that they really see it as an immediate problem. And so the first thing has to do with rethinking the framing even around climate change. The number two, also as I mentioned, has to do with the language. In itself, do we then go via the route of just warning? Is it actually global warming or global warning in itself? And to the extent that also oftentimes also, it is also important to recognize also who are the messengers in this case carrying the message. That is central in the sense that to the extent that those who are the messengers in this case carrying the message are immediately detached even from the very communities which they seek to engage, then that in itself also creates a pushback. And so it is important for us to also recognize that there is also the need to also identify local actors or local champions. And I believe that is where the activists and the NGOs also come in, whereby they are able to identify these persons who are nested within the communities as anchors for change. And I believe that elsewhere there are grassroots examples of that happening in different locations. That is also really bringing the message to the fore. And I believe that progressing with that would be critical in also championing the agenda. And also, more importantly, also, we shouldn't also adopt the posturing that we are going to teach the communities what is really happening. It is also important to also bear in mind that by virtue of their geographical positioning, and by their place dependency, they would have some accumulated level of knowledge. And by this, I'm referring to the traditional, local, or ecological knowledge of their surroundings, recognizing that they have lived in this environment, fragile environment, for a very long time. And for that reason, they would have adopted some default coping strategies that have enabled them, even as it were, manage even the vagaries of the situations that they find themselves. And so to that extent, I mean, pitching it as in a way whereby they are also able to bring their experiences to the fore. And then at the same time, those experiences being carried forward and then shaped in itself, I think that in itself then now moves it beyond the realm of just in itself seeking their input, but then again, bringing them on as partners to the conversation. I believe that when that begins to happen in a very meaningful and in a concerted way, then we'll be able to see a lot more, if you like, action or engagement, even with the issues around climate change. And one way to do this, recognizing that there are also inherent power dynamics also at play in this case, whereby there is also the risk of the process being hijacked by a few. It is important to safeguard against those developments. And how do we begin to do that? Which is why I also propose the idea of representational groups even across different communities where they are impacted to really be able to democratize the process. And once the process is democratized, different perspectives are able to come to the fore. And for that reason, also that in itself also provides also national government with the empirical basis of what is really happening. And on that basis, they are then able to go to the negotiation table with propositions that would really be transformative in terms of meeting the actual needs on the ground. So I think I will leave it as this, and then we can then interrogate this further.
Thank you, Dr. Festus. And so that we can just go deeper into this issue of amplifying the legitimate voice of the people in the front line. Laura, what do you think are the ways to ensure that climate change issues are actually taken up by politicians and by policymakers and governments, and from issues they are turned into interventions that can actually support communities? What is your thought, Laura?
Thanks for the question, Julius. I think that the answer begins with governments, politicians really coming to terms with the challenges or the issues that have been brought to the fore by the oil and gas industry, and ensuring that those challenges and issues aren't carried into a transitional or renewable economy. So, the first thing is that the types of inequalities that the oil and gas industry is fraught with haven't been fundamentally challenged. They haven't been fundamentally challenged by renewables, and they haven't been fundamentally challenged by any considerable political strategy in contemporary history, really. So, and this is from my vantage point, because none of the development strategies that governments have come up with actually confront the underlying cause of the types of inequalities that are perpetuated or propagated by our energy sectors in Africa. And so that underlying cause, and I'm going to use the C word now, but none of them have fundamentally challenged the organization of production along capitalist lines. So we can maybe take a step even further back to what Dr. Festus was discussing, but I guess we'd be remiss really not to mention the very deep relationship between our natural resources and racist exploitation. So for me, the social relations that natural resource extraction enables or creates is really the utmost challenge for politicians and I guess governance practitioners in Africa. One example is obviously the many vestiges of colonialism that are perpetuated by many of the for example, big tropical commodity companies. So companies like Socfin, which is a Belgian holding company that operates palm oil and rubber plantations in many through subsidiaries in many parts of Africa and also in Southeast Asia. Many of those companies are funded or were funded and created during colonial times, but they still operate in countries that were once occupied by colonial powers. And so the implication of that for oil and gas, and more importantly for renewables, is that we can't blindly or willfully fall into the same political economy that oil and gas produced. And so I guess three sort of salient points are worth considering. The first is that locally owned companies have a disproportionately low stake in the continent's renewable energy sector. So the continent's distributed renewable energy sector is still predominantly dominated by foreign players. The second issue is that although most of the large development agencies that work in Africa link their funding to renewables and to climate adaptation, access to finance tends to be disproportionately geared towards multinational companies that are based in Europe or North America, or companies that are led by entrepreneurs from those regions. So the profits are largely not remaining in Africa. And I guess a final point is that the governance framework that politicians or governance practitioners pursue is important. It matters. So, you know, the pandemic, I think we can't not mention COVID because of the times that we're in, but the pandemic has really shown many African countries, including those that stand to benefit from an energy market transition, that we need to build and perhaps rebuild energy systems on the continent, primarily so that they're resilient to future crises like market shocks, but also so that they're resilient to the issues that climate change is prone to, like natural disasters and pandemics. So we must really think about politics and governance, especially the politics and governance, I think, related to deprivation, and how the next energy regime is going to redefine that. You know, in places like, and I'm sorry to bemoan the Niger Delta, but I think it's such a rich case study of what we're talking about. But we've seen how young people in those areas have actually been radicalized to violence by deprivation in a context where they live, you know, in the neighborhood of oil and gas industries, but they really don't benefit in any substantial or substantive way from those industries. So, you know, many, like I guess I said earlier, many of the countries that are oil and gas, natural resource rich, are also very poor. And those three challenges that I mentioned, I think, are going to be vital in the transition, and so vital in considerations for policymakers and politicians.
Sorry, we've just had a power blackout and it's affected everything. And apologies for that.
My point.
Yeah, sorry. So I hope you had finalized your points, Laura. And one of the things that I think that you actually brought out also was the energy transition. And just coming to Ekimini, one of the questions that has been asked is, what do we do about environmental degradation that is powered by governments, and governments actually shrink the space for citizens to engage? And what do you think are some of the things that we can actually put in place as some to bring out the voice of the people?
Oh, thank you so much. I really love to talk about energy transition because it's something I'm really working on. So when we talk about energy transition and how it affects the citizens, I want to talk about it contextually, like the African context. Africa has like a very good population, like we're a good market. And the great part of this population is that they're young people, like a very large number of people in Africa are young. So that means there is so much for us as citizens in Africa. But when it comes to energy transition, I see Africa as marginalized when it comes to these discussions, basically because so far, from what I have researched and what I've seen, I feel like the models created by by different international bodies, different schools, people researching on energy transition, doesn't look at Africa contextually. Because if you're talking about energy transition, if you're talking about moving from one form of energy, from one behavioral pattern, one use of energy to the next, you need to consider the social part of it, which has to do with the people. Basically, energy transition, if it is to happen, we have to follow a technological approach. Social, including the people, the infrastructure, and the cultural beliefs of these people. Because when we talk about energy transition, we're not just talking about, oh yeah, the energy sources. We're not talking about energy sources. We're not talking about sending and supplying energy to the people. We have to look into how this energy we supply is used by these people. How do they use it? Do people we sell our energy to, the people we supply our energy to, use it for processes that produce carbon? For instance, if Africa as a country, if Africa as a continent completely eradicates emissions due to energy sources, there will still be emissions from service demand, because companies that produce cement still give like high amounts of CO2 use. So that it's really, really important to look at the citizens. The citizens are the ones affected. All of us are citizens, including the government. Everybody is a citizen of a particular place. So if we look at it as we are the one at the receiving end, then we can be able to address the issue of climate change. And like I think Julius said, it talked about 60% of the African population going into farming. But if you look at the consumption data for Africa, okay, let me use Nigeria as a context. If you look at the energy consumption data for Nigeria, you would see that a great amount of the energy use goes into domestic housing in where people live. That's because we don't have so much companies. So if we are to transition, if we are to move, talk about energy transition for Africa, it has a lot to do with the people. So a lot of this energy consumed domestically by the people is maybe the way they turn on their televisions, the way they behave, their cultural pattern. Particularly in Nigeria, there's like high prevalence of people still cooking with wood. There are people still lighting lighting from coal-related resources. So these are part of what's contributing to these emissions. So if we are to talk about energy transition in Africa, we must understand where we're coming from, which is from wood initially, then to coal, then to oil and gas, and then we're currently trying to move to renewables. We have to understand where we're coming from and see where we're heading in the context of the cultural pattern of Africans, in the context of the infrastructure, the existing infrastructure, energy infrastructures in Africa, and in the context of how citizens accept whatever solution, whatever technical solution we've brought up. So energy transition discussion has a lot to do with the citizens, because even if I completely decarbonize sources, there will still be carbon emission due to use. So it's really, really important that we include citizens in this communication. Let them know the effect of their service demand, the effect of what they use the energy we supply for, in the effect of the contribution that makes to the complete emissions for Africa. Thank you.
Interesting. Thank you. Let them know, let the citizens know. Now, the big question here is, do we actually know that we are in the third industrial revolution? And do we actually understand that it's a green revolution that is happening right now? Africa missed out in the first revolution. It missed out on the second industrial revolution. And now we are in the third revolution, which is actually a green one. And I would want to get your views on these panelists. What exactly, therefore, should we do in a world which is changing, in a world where energy transition is the core thing that we are talking about, but also addressing climate impacts, and where actually seemingly Africa is largely not quite involved significantly in the energy discussions? So let me get your views. Let me start with Ezekiel, please. What do you think we should do as a continent to not miss out on this third industrial revolution?
Well, thank you, Julius, once again. I think that, like you said, Africa has a new opportunity to make up from the first and second revolution that we missed out. Fortunately, we have the Africa Agenda 2063, which I think goes 7, makes clear provision for how to develop and utilize renewable energy. So as a continent, we have our own framework that should guide how we must promote renewable energy. Beyond that, we are also party to some global platforms like the SDG 7, Sustainable Energy for All Forum. In fact, even the nationally determined contributions, which is one of the requirements of the Paris Climate Agreement. These are all provisions that African countries who are party to the UNFCCC have made commitment to. So there's no justification why, as Africans, we cannot take advantage of this. So in terms of how we can practically move forward, the first point of call, in my view, is to look at our respective NDCs. Every country that is party to the UNFCCC or the Paris Climate Agreement is supposed to develop their own ambitions, how they intend to contribute to achieving the 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees Celsius. So in that provision, we can now see how the country is making effort to upscale renewable energy. So in the context of Ghana, the government is making a lot of effort in that regard. If you look at our NDCs, there's some impressive ambitions, to upscale renewable energy. And I must also commend the government of Ghana in terms of the progress we are making, even from moving from oil and gas to renewable energy. So there's some progress in made there. We have developed our renewable energy master plan to increase our renewable energy by 1,300 megawatts, by the year 2030. And even the plan talks about creating jobs creating about 220,000 jobs by 2030 along the value chain of renewable energy. So we have all this provision as a country. So which makes provision for job creation for young people in Ghana, youth unemployment will be curtailed, significantly. So again, we have the provision. We have the African Agenda 2063. At the national level, we have our renewable energy master plan. We have our energy policy. So those are policies put in place. So the issue now is how do we practically, ensure that we are able to really, really develop the renewable energy agenda. And thankfully, I think the private sector is increasingly becoming interested in the renewable energy agenda, in the transition agenda, even though usually they are seen as a bit at the opposite end when it comes to development. But they are also seeing the benefit of renewable energy, even for their own cost-effective management of their business. So at least in terms of all this framework, all this architecture, I think that the African government, civil society, citizens, the media, must put in place all the necessary mechanisms or effort to ensure that we take advantage of this growing renewable energy agenda. In any case, we need energy to industrialize. We need energy to grow. So let's harness renewable energy to help us achieve our aim to industrialize, as Africans. Even though for me, 2063 is a bit long, but at least we have some timelines to work with. Yeah. So yeah, that would be my initial comment for now. Thank you, Julius.
Thank you, Ezekiel. Dr. Festus, what do we do so that we don't miss out on this transition, on this industrial revolution, a green one? And as you talk about that, also try and also provide some insights around also how we can take advantage of this as we deal with the climate change impacts that also get to affect sectors differently. Let's just start out on the second conversation, please. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Julius. And just to say that, again, it is important to also highlight the fact that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to resolving this. And necessarily, every kind of solution that we propose ought to be context-specific, and it ought to be multi-level, and it ought to be across scales. And why do I say this? Say, for example, also, and as Chibeze rightly highlighted, there have been a number of initiatives, and for that reason, also efforts also from the governmental point of view, and also even championed also by civil society groupings in order to achieving this end. For example, I will take the Reduce Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation Program, the RED Plus program, which is even championed in order to ensure that, in fact, carbon stocks in itself are sufficiently replaced. And for that reason, also even trying to leverage on things like, if you like, payment for ecosystem services as a way to ramp up community support around some of these initiatives. But then again, what is also important to really realize is, and I think that we cannot emphasize this point enough, is the fact that who is driving these agendas? And to what extent is the local ownership of some of these processes? And to what end exactly are they achieving? And are these ends in themselves actually reflecting the key priorities of the African people? Because then again, there has been conversations even around that in this third revolution, in fact, carbon neutrality should be at the forefront. But then again, from a practical perspective or from a practical standpoint, although the cost of inaction will be great for Africa, given the disproportionate burden that we do on climate change, it is also important to bear in mind that we are not all at the same stage. And for that reason, maybe carbon neutrality, maybe for a country like Nigeria, might not necessarily be, or the ambitions or the target might not necessarily be similar for, let's say, a country like Somalia, because of the different level of, let's say, developmental trajectory that they are on. And so these are critical things to put to the fore. But then practically speaking, we need to do something. And so as a starting point, and I believe that conversations like this also really set up very nicely to really bring these issues to the fore. And they should be sustained. And then more importantly also, I did see that one of our attendees also pointed out the critical role played by the media. I believe that there has to be a lot more of these conversations happening in the media space to really break down the issues in a much more engaging way. And I would also advocate for public-private partnerships in terms of trying to explore or in itself investment in these green technologies, whereby governments are now moving to the point where maybe tax holidays are really granted, or maybe reliefs or incentives are granted to businesses, which are also wanting to take advantage of some of these opportunities in order to ensure that they green their enterprises. That is also very important. In as much as we are trying to draw on, let's say, international or global level funds available, we also have to look at pathways, which I believe that maybe other panels have really touched on, the financing elements of some of these initiatives. I believe that pursuing this in a much more coherent way would be critical. Because at the moment, my concern is that there are a number of, as it were, fragmented efforts here and there. And so, but then which are not very well, if you like, coordinated. It is important to have a really proper coordination. And I believe that as a first step, a lot of these African countries have come up with, let's say, their nationally determined contributions. But then again, it's important to widen the scope of this to ensure that at least sector by sector, to see what realistically we can contribute. And that in itself can only happen when the engagement net is widened, to ensure that these representations are really, as it were, captured to really reflect the different perspectives across the board. So that is what I would say for now as a way forward. We need to do something, but then in doing it, we shouldn't really adopt a one-size-fits-all approach. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And as you just said it, a case-to-case, sector-by-sector basis. Just coming to you, Laura, and we understand the predicament that our smallholder farmers face in this continent due to climate change impact. Particularly if you're looking at women, for instance, and I can see a question that came in through the chat where a colleague asks and says actually climate change is experienced from country to country in Africa. Example, how women who seek gold nuggets see it is not the same way as women who are in agriculture see it. So what would you propose as some of the interesting perspectives into dealing with the differentiated impacts of climate change on women within the agriculture sector? And how do we advance sustainable agriculture if there is actually sustainable agriculture?
Thank you for that question. That's a really big question. So perhaps I'll start broadly speaking just about the opportunities in renewable energy in general, and then maybe I can zone in on women specifically. I read a report by the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, I think it is, and that report suggests that the number of jobs in the renewable energy sector could be as much as 29 million by 2050, or could increase to as much as 29 million by 2050, which doesn't sound like a huge number, but I think for local economies, it certainly has, considerable opportunities, or creates considerable opportunities. So the global energy transition is full of opportunities to create new jobs and really to reshape all aspects of how energy is produced, and like Ekemini was saying, how it's distributed. That's the first opportunity. I think the second is that there are plenty of opportunities for diversity and inclusion in the renewables value chain, and perhaps that's where women specifically come in. So there are different types of skill sets, different capacities that are going to be required in the renewables value chain. And I think if we leverage the opportunity that we have right now to think about how, and I said this in I guess my opening remarks, but we have a real opportunity right now to think about how these opportunities can be equitably accessible. So equity is less about equality and more about redress, right? So equitable would mean making sure that the new renewables value chain is one that prioritizes the inclusion of women and other vulnerable bodies, so we can think about how we engage the disabled and of course how we engage the poor. And I guess ultimately how to ensure that the transition is equitable and that it's just. I realize that I keep repeating equitable, but I think that bears repetition, because what we see from oil and gas is that it's the most inequitable industry on the planet. And so if we're going to do away with the inequity of oil and gas, then it has to be replaced by something that's much more transformative. You spoke about smallholder farmers, women specifically. I think it's about creating opportunities to engage in the new economy, upskilling people. Dr. Festus mentioned this idea of indigenization. So how do we leverage the types of skills and the types of capacities that women, smallholder farmers already have? How do we make sure that when there are market shocks or when there are, crises that we haven't necessarily accounted for, that the safety net or the welfare net of the state catches those types of people? So what financing arrangements are available specifically for women? What upskilling is available specifically for women in rural or in agrarian communities? I hope that answers your question, your very big question.
No, thank you for that. Thank you for that. And you've shared a couple of insights around that. Just coming into Ekemini as we also just approach concluding some of the views and thoughts that you've shared. So what does it matter then for the African people, for the woman, the community, for the young person who does not have job, for someone who is disabled? What does it matter to engage in this new discourse on green development, on green recovery, for example, as we come off COVID, on green transition and renewable energy transition? What does it matter? And how do you tell them to be involved then?
When it comes to the involvement of women in transition-related issues and climate-related issues, I feel there is a part for everybody. When we come, like looking at my class for energy systems, you have people from diverse backgrounds coming in to bring in their ideas. So for climate change discussions, for transition discussions, everybody is not speaking the same language. There's someone speaking from the philosophical point of view. There's someone speaking from the technical point of view. There's someone speaking from maybe the agricultural point of view. And there's also someone speaking from the finance point of view. So energy transition, is all inclusive. So personally, I think that because there is a particular problem I have noticed with Africa, and that is lack of data, we can create more jobs for people by telling them, okay, yeah, you don't have a job, you don't have something you're doing. Why don't you try to help us get climate data so that we can be able to model solutions that are particular to a certain region? I feel that when it comes to climate change, energy systems, and transition, the women have like a very vital role to play. They can easily work. It's not something that you have to pull every machines or pull. So it's not strenuous. It's something mental. It's something that has to do with it's something that has to do with you as a person. Do you want to work in energy transition? Do you want to work in line with energy transition? Are you interested in making sure the climate stays safe for a longer more time? So it's to incorporate people that are really interested. The first part of it is to create jobs in area of climate change data acquisition as regards Africa, to help us model this specific transition we're looking towards. Another thing I'd like to talk about is every time I look at Africa and I look at specifically Nigeria, and we're talking about unemployment, we're talking about poverty. I recently did research and saw like about 240 children died daily because of hunger, and yet we are a very rich continent, we're a very rich place, we're a very rich country. It breaks my heart. It gives me reason to go back and think, what can we do to help the people that, oh well, they don't have a job, the people that do not the people that are not necessarily earning or contributing in any way. I would like to talk about this in the context of Congo. We know that the Republic of Congo has is a home to 60% of cobalt. And yes, the world is moving to producing batteries that will be useful in electric cars. The transition we're talking about has a lot to do with cobalt, and cobalt is coming from Congo. I don't see why Congo should be poor. I don't see why the unemployed, there should be high unemployment rate in Congo. I don't see how a lot of people should be suffering any kind of problem in Congo, because I feel if our government understand the value of what we have, it will go a long way in helping us include women, including the marginalized, including people having issues. So basically, one thing Africa needs to do is to understand the value of the natural resources we have. There's this bond that I hear with China and the rest of it. Why do we give out our resources and still have, because we know that if these people are the ones operating these resources, the finance doesn't basically come back to Africa, it goes out. So we have to, as a continent, try to keep as much, ensure that as much of the generated resources from Africa stays in Africa to help the marginalized, to help the people who do not have jobs. Then we just also have to understand the concept of diversity. Yeah, a lot of the jobs we have as a people, a lot of the jobs we have as a continent is not women inclusive. The government should look more into diversifying different sectors of the economy to include these people. Yeah, people that maybe cannot work could be good writers. They could know how best to use their minds. Women who maybe have lost their farmlands to flood, or have been affected by this. Have been affected by the current climate change effect, can get a job in energy, in climate data acquisition. So we just need to create more jobs, understand the value of what we have, use the power of our large population. We need to harness that power, and I think everybody will be included. Everybody will be fine if we do this and what every other panelist have discussed. Thank you.
We were almost actually coming to an end of the agriculture discussion, but a question just came in from Francis. The transition will impact the petrochemical sector strongly, and now what do we have as alternatives? Alternative options that we can be able to leverage on to still advance our agriculture. Dr. Festus, what is your say in 1 minute, and then we can just come to more of the finalization aspects of the conversation.
Yes, so thanks, Julius, for that. I believe that there are still a number of options that we do have, and some of which have already been highlighted. For example, there is still, I believe, a lot of space even within the agricultural sector. And more importantly, also even in the service-oriented economy space in itself, building the human resource capacity in those avenues is also very important. And more importantly, also, I believe there is space for value addition in terms of, let's say, the resources that are being kind of exploited. At the minute, you realize that most of them are exported in their raw form. And for that reason, in terms of the value contribution in itself, tends to be very minimal. And so to that extent, I think that when we prioritize, if you like, in this particular respect, avenues by which we can add value to our existing produce, particularly, let's say, for example, from the agricultural sector in itself. For example, in the case of cocoa, even from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, there has been discussions even around that, of which, by the way, is really central even to issues around climate change, even being imparting on the cocoa sector. That in itself could also create advanced opportunities even further downstream in terms of people not primarily dependent just on, let's say, cocoa farms alone, but then even people midway even in that value chain. And so identifying such opportunities even across the board would also be critical in terms of plugging those gaps, I would say. And that in itself is critically hinged on intensive engagement and intensive research around these areas, because at the moment also, there are avenues where we lack comprehensive data on to be able to make robust or sound decisions in that space.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Festus. Now, this is where we are, and this is actually the point where we have to think through how we move forward. So we've come from a place of the inequalities of the fossil fuel industries and the realities within our continent. We've gone to a place where we appreciate that climate change is urgent because the impacts are already being felt. We've actually also gone and talked about how citizens, some of them are not aware, and how we can communicate and enable them be aware, but also allow them participate through mechanisms that also gives them the platform to say exactly what they want and their priorities are. And we are at a point where now we always need that critical mass, that mass of people, that group of people that will actually speak to power and demonstrate the kind of transition and engagement we want. So to all of you, a quick question. How do we coordinate the fragmented citizen voices and actions across the continent in our countries on climate change going forward? And then I'll come back to you to get your final remarks as the hour comes to an end. Let me start with Ezekiel, please.
Well, thank you, Julius. In terms of coordination, I think that some efforts are being made. Just that we need to strengthen those efforts. We need to make those efforts better, more effective, more participatory. Because if you go to local level, you always find some organized groups, be it farmer groups, be it youth groups, women groups. So they are organized in the first place. But how do we, help them to become more effective or function? How then do we also connect them, to organized groups at the national level and organized groups at the regional level and even at the global level? So in terms of moving forward, I think that, and Julius, even at regional level, we have PACJA, we have, different platforms. So I think it's about connecting the dots, and when it comes to mobilization, that is actually the role of civil society. So I want to propose that at least it could be a snowball approach. Those that we know, we can start with them. As we get them organized, new ones can also come on board. And then over time, we can get to a point where information flow will be very easy and very effective from the local level to the global level. So at any given point, we can all be at the same time, and then we can address issues based on context, not one fit all, like Dr. Sega said. So I think that for me, that is what I will share on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Laura, what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you. I agree very much with what Ezekiel has said. I think it's, building local capacity for local solutions. I think it's supporting the efforts of civil society. I think it's supporting those efforts through awareness raising, but also through finance and, resource mobilization. I think we've seen this year, actually, that many of the stakeholders in the conversation that we're having are very organized. That they have the capacity to bring attention and to articulate the issues that they're faced with. But I definitely think for this particular issue, it takes, I guess, each of us across sectors perhaps agreeing that there is an issue, that there is a problem, and agreeing that because we've identified this shared problem, that on one hand is climate change and on the other hand is a just transition, how we build capacity in the already organized communities, so organized by way of civil society, to move us forward in a way that's more productive and, again, more equitable than the way that we've been going thus far.
Thank you so much, Laura. Akimini, what is your take on this?
Yeah, what's my take on this is I might actually have like a very controversial thing. Yeah, because when it comes to what initially when I started off the discussion, I talked about different actors. I listed the international bodies, the national bodies, the subnational bodies, the energy companies, then the citizens, the people involved. I feel that and not enough effort is put in place by the African government. They are doing some things, but it's not enough. Why do I feel this way? Looking at the scenarios, let me use the Sustainable Development Goals outlined by the United Nations as a context. Let me talk about that, using that as a context. Yeah, the United Nations has said we need to achieve clean, affordable, and accessible energy to everyone, everywhere. But then there's still this missing link of implementation and accountability. How do we know that what a government announces as their progress is actually what is happening? Yeah, the government might say, oh yeah, we've gone maybe 50% renewable this year. We're heading to 100 in 2030. But the question is, what are the metrics for measurement? Because it really boils down to the fact that with these international discussions, we have a way of painting the government really beautiful, but deep down the citizens are suffering because they are not feeling the impact of these actions that our governments they're saying they've taken. So to be able to unearth, to be able to get everybody, all the actors at work, there has to be something central. There has to be a kind of reporting mechanism from the citizen to the community to the subnational body. Someone has to be accountable to someone. And so it has to be ingrained in our subconscious, like on all levels of the hierarchy, that this is important. And actions taken at the community level, communicated to the subnational level, then so they should be aware of communicating. And also when I look at the issue of this transition, I see it as different African countries are on different levels when it comes to transition. Some countries might be, oh yeah, at least they have like steady supply of electricity, and some are still very far away. Maybe they don't even have, a lot of people don't have access to clean electricity. They don't have access to clean cooking. How do we help not make these people feel like, oh yeah, the transition effort shouldn't be like, oh yeah, I have achieved my own. What have you achieved? There should be a kind of way to allow African countries collaborate, contribute, and support each other. Yeah, if there is a resource in Congo that Ghana needs, there should be something more. There should be an easy way of transferring assets to help African countries levelize. That's just my take on it.
Thank you so much. Dr. Festus, your word, just one word on this, and then we can see how to conclude the session. Our time is up.
Right. So in just brief sense, I believe transparency is important. And by transparency, I'm making reference to the fact that a lot more of the cross-learning and cross-sharing has to happen. And by this, we should find a way to navigate beyond political boundaries, because I believe that if we were to go country by country, a lot of interesting initiatives are happening, which is really positive. But then again, how do we ensure that these joined up efforts really galvanize together to ensure that at least as a continent-wide, this particular shared problem is addressed sufficiently? And to that extent, that transparency thing needs to be at the forefront. And more importantly also, it has to be cross-sectorally pursued. I believe at the moment, a lot of the discussion is very sectorial, and we need to move beyond that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would love to open up again and again and again, but as we all of us know, it's never enough on a virtual setting to take it beyond the level we've tried to do. I want to appreciate our panelists, and they have been amazing. I even felt like I've been talking to 15-year experience experts, and just to the thought of it, you are all of you young people, and this is an amazing asset that we have as a continent that we need to tap into. As we go back to the director, ACEP, I would want to say that first we want to say thank you to the organizers, Africa Climate Energy Policy, and thank you also to the people who have supported ACEP to bring this together. I would want to acknowledge the sponsors and partners, Kina Advisory Limited and Ochua International, Oxfam, NORAD, and Ford Foundation. Also, we want to pass our thanks to you, and also we want to ask everybody to keep this conversation going. And just concluding remarks from our end, that one, we need to solve our governance challenges, because climate change has provided us a new opportunity to actually look from within and address some of the governance challenges, and also to make sure that we do not miss out on an energy transition that is equitable and that serves the interests of the continent. But at the same time, we need to ensure that the disenfranchised, the marginalized, the young people, vulnerable groups, women are leading in these efforts. And I want to say thank you again, and back to you, Mr. Ben. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julius. I think I I totally enjoyed this session, listening to the energy, on the panel, and clearly shows that citizens, the young ones, really have to pick up, the next conversation about the transition and the next economy that we can derive from energy transition, and the story about, the disconnect between policy and action. We don't want to hear it, next 20, 30 years. So the responsibility is on us, to pick this up and ensure that we can extract action from the policies that are developed. And also we need to start planning now to ensure that we are not left behind. Because clearly, as we've learned from all the panels, the transition is happening. How we tap into that and optimize it is our responsibility. And I must thank all of us, the panels, the participants, our sponsors, Oxfam, Ford Foundation, our partners, Kina Advisory and Nurture International, for being part of this wonderful conversation. And this is just the beginning. And I think we still need to connect and keep the conversation going, keep governments acting, keep companies responsible, and keep citizens demanding for the right things to be done. The next steps are that we're going to consolidate all the issues, the key issues that have emerged in this 2-day conversation, and share, so that we can have pointers as to what next steps we need to really engage on to ensure that we are achieving results with this kind of conversation and not just another talk shop. So I'm grateful to all of you. I'm grateful to the participants who have stayed on here on Zoom and also on Facebook, watching it live. The videos will still be available for people to continue to pick on the conversation and listen to the dynamic, contributions from panelists, so that we can keep the conversation going and ensure that energy transition will not leave Africa behind. I'm grateful and have a good day. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.